to look at not only what happened, but also the context of these events. I want to, basically concentrate on this long period that we have been talking about. Most people concentrate on the period after independence, but of course, you cannot really draw a line and say that this is the period that we should concentrate on, because history is something that you cannot really arbitrarily cut and paste, because history is a flow of things, and I think we need to really look at how things have evolved in this country over a period of time. And of course, these things do not happen in a vacuum, and there is a background to it, and I think we need to concentrate on that background as well. That is what I want to say at the beginning. But it is also important that we also look at what really provides the background to some of the things that have happened. And we have actually done that in relation to earlier events, like for instance, if you take the 1971 uprising, a lot has been said, a lot has been written, a lot of analysis has been done, and a lot of steps have been taken to address some of the factors that had contributed to that major youth uprising in this country in 1971. And then the same applies to other events, like for instance 1983 riots and their aftermath. And then of course we have had major violent events taking place in the country in 1988-89. So we of course also witnessed a long period of violent conflict in the north and east, which we popularly call the Northeast War. So the point is that we need to really not take each and every incident in isolation. We'll have to also see how these events have emerged and how best we could address these issues. In modern societies, we always talk about adopting policies that would help us deal with some of these major events that take place in a country. Now, for instance, 1971 uprising was interpreted as as an event that really had a very important background to it, especially unrest among underprivileged rural youth in Sri Lanka. So we have seen certain steps being taken thereafter to address some of those grievances of young people who were disaffected and who participated in those violent events. So that is probably what I want to say by way of background, and I'm quite sure we will be able to take up some of these points for further discussion as we move on.
Thank you, Professor Hettige. My next question is to our second guest. He is a former secretary of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry into Large-Scale Fraud and Corruption, or PRESIFAC. He was also a former director of the Sri Lanka Parliament. Mr. Lasil De Silva, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.
Mr. De Silva, when we speak of governance and the three main organs of government, the executive, the legislature, and judiciary, we are told that there needs to be adequate checks and balances between these three organs of government. Is that actually happening? where are we going wrong in terms of governance, in terms of the three organs of government, in your opinion?
Actually, the three organs, as you said very precisely, are the main institutions that gets involved in running day-to-day affairs in the country. Now, basically, let me start from Parliament. Now, Parliament is the supreme institution in the country. That consists of members of Parliament elected by us, and they represent us. Actually, Parliament, in that sense, is a body representing people.
Absolutely.
So when I say it represents people, they have to do that in the interest of the country and in the interest of the people. Now, you asked me one question, whether these three institutions, the judiciary, the parliament, and the executive. Unfortunately, these three institutions, as they very rightly say, the Montesquieu theory, it should be independently functioning. Now, my biggest problem is, does that happen in this country now? Actually, let me go back to 1978 Constitution. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And the Constitution had laid down, say in the 78 Constitution, there are certain, say, drastic changes they had made. This is the second constitution, the third constitution in the country since independence, because we started with the Salisbury, and then the 72 constitution, 78. Actually, that was between a period of six years. Unfortunately, we have been going on, changing constitutions, and the 78 constitutions brought vast changes. Now, the sweeping changes they introduced, one was this executive presidency. I believe after the introduction of the presidency, the executive president, according to him, he had said that he can do anything other than changing a woman, a man, the other way, all that. And he can do every other thing under the sun. Actually, I agree with him that he had done so many things of that nature, having not been bothered about to see about the consequences. And actually, we are facing all the consequences today. Let me say about the judiciary, right? With the due respect, we have heard. Now, there was a CJ that was thrown out in a manner that was not acceptable. Who did that? Parliament did it. Then previously, there were chief justices who were not, the person who was due for promotion was not given the promotion, and another person was brought in. All that happens. If you have the services streamlined in that sense, the judiciary, the administrative, all that, I personally believe all those traditions, all those standards, all those accepted norms will have to be observed. In my view, as you very rightly said, where are we? I believe the parliament does not respect the judiciary, the executive does not respect the judiciary, and we see the consequences. All that had eventually created big issues. My biggest worry, the concern is the culture of impunity. Why is that culture of impunity exists in a country like Sri Lanka? Because we had a very good reputation after independence for a couple of years, a decade or more. Ours was considered to be one of the, when you compare with other countries also, it was considered to be one of the best compared to developed countries. Parliament, that's a place where I have been for nearly 35 years. I know the standards we had maintained in the parliament. Parliament is the supreme institution. Now, do they live up to all those examples, standards that is required? I think I just mentioned about your question. Let me come back to what they are doing in Parliament right now. To a great extent, I feel they are not doing what they have to do. You can see them, struggling very much to retain power. They buy members from the opposition to make the government strong. They wanted to keep power even by spending millions and billions to buy. Actually, these are not things that you could see in anywhere in other places of the world. And public money, previously they said it was 2.5 million. Rohana Hettiarachchi had recently having call for information, under the Right to Information Act. Apparently, it had been revealed that for a day, say they spend 4.5 billion a day. My question, I'd like to put it back to you. Are you satisfied from a parliament where you spend your money, right, 4.5 billion a day? The biggest problem in this country, they are the lawmakers. Making law alone does not mean anything. They have to see whether the law is being enforced throughout the country and effectively doing the needful. Maybe we hear all about corruptions. We hear all about laws being flouted without, nothing happens. They continuously keep on doing all that. And actually, they know that they will never be dealt with by the law.
Mr. De Silva, what needs to be done, in your opinion, to correct this culture of impunity?
Yeah, it is again in the hands of the politicians, because I would directly pinpoint. Let me quote an instance I think the public should know. This government was given a mandate. Actually, a number of things. They promised all that during the elections. Say stop corruption, enforce rule of law, speed up and improve the public sector. So many things. I can't remember also, it was a long list of things to be done. Now, to put the whole country right and how to, say, remove the culture of, or at least end the culture of impunity, I think you should have the will to do so. It is very unfortunate, having promised one thing, in the end, after having got the power, I don't know whether we are in a position to take them to courts because they have lied and taken over power. I might say it that way, because within 1 year, now from the, say, they won the elections on the 8th of January. I know the commission, with regard to what you mentioned, where I was serving as the secretary, it was appointed on the 15th of March, say, within a matter of 1 year, till about end of that year, say about January, February, by that time, we were able to send the message across to the public institutions, public officers, that getting involved in corruption is going to be dangerous. And it came to a situation, I think the public officers were trying to, discipline themselves. It came to a situation thereafter, I believe it was the bond scam, the bond issue. And probably during that period, there were all kinds of discussions that it was one of the biggest robberies that had taken place in the country. And there were direct fingers pointed at, the powerful politicos in the government. And I believe, to a great extent, there was an attempt to disrupt what was being done by the commissions in the interest of the country, because that was our duty. And we were not hesitant. We were genuinely interested in doing all that for the benefit of the people.
So political interference is rampant across the board.
All throughout the system. Actually, those are matters I think we'll be able to talk about, how these political interferences came about and what they had done to sort of clean up all that and then keep public officers free, independently to do their job. But all that was promised, eventually all that never happened. Now, to go back to your question, how to end up impunity? As I said, you need the political will. This government did not have the political will, so thereafter we have ended up back again in a worse situation where culture of impunity exists all over.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. De Silva. Professor Hettige, in Sri Lanka we have an education system that is divided on ethno-linguistic religious lines. You have Buddhist schools, you have Hindu schools, you have Catholic schools, you have Muslim schools, as a result of which children from the very inception of their being are divided. You have girls' schools, you have boys' schools, and then finally you try to integrate all of these children into a society, and that's where you go wrong. How do you view this, and in terms of education reform, in terms of having an inclusive education system, what does the Ministry of Education, for example, need to do?
Well, I think it is not the Ministry of Education as such. We bring about change through well-designed policies. Policies designed on the basis of what we call policy analysis, which is, of course, a very serious matter. We'll have to really look at, what we expect from education in a modern society. Of course, people may, talk about different objectives of education. But on the other hand, there are certain basic national objectives of any education system. For instance, the point that you made about divisions. Now, of course, divisions, are quite common in, most modern societies. Of course, societies are divided horizontally and also vertically. We are talking about, class divisions. We talk about, huge class disparities in some societies. And of course, huge class disparities are not sustainable when people have, let's say, egalitarian, values. In a society where you have egalitarian values, what people want is equality of opportunity, social justice, and so on and so forth. And therefore, when you have, huge, let's say, class disparities, you have a problem, because it can lead to unrest, it can lead to even violent conflict. But on the other hand, we also see in modern societies, various other divisions. For instance, as you already mentioned, you have, ethnic divisions, because many societies have, ethnic groups, existing side by side, and then you also have various other divisions based on religion, for instance, because you have, many religions being, practiced by various segments of society. And then also you have divisions based on language. Of course, if you take the case of Europe, European countries, 28 countries came together to form the European Union. And now, of course, when you form one political bloc, one economic bloc like the European Union, you have to address those issues of inequality, both horizontal and vertical. And therefore, they had to come up with various policies to address, those divisions. For instance, the language issue was very important because there were 23 languages being used in the European Union area. So I mean, when you have so many languages being used, certainly you can't have monolingual communities, as part of the European Union, because you expect people to move around, find employment in different countries, and being able to communicate when they move around, and so on and so forth. So those are matters that need to be addressed through public policies. I think it is the same in the case of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a country where we have all the world religions being practiced here. We have all the world religions being practiced here. Then we have certainly different ethnic communities. Then of course we also have different languages being used. Fortunately for us, we don't have too many languages like in the case of India, but at least we have 3 languages being used simultaneously across the country by different segments of society. Now these are all issues that can be addressed through public policies, and when we talk about public policies, education policy is very, very critical. And of course, you know that this is not something that happened all of a sudden. There have been debates on these issues for many, many years, even before independence. In fact, some of the legislation, some of the policies that were introduced in this country to address these issues predate even independence. Like, for instance, our education bill that established free education, or popularly known as Kannangara reforms, was enacted by the State Council in 1939. And the free education was introduced in the country based on the 1939 bill in the early 1940s, so it's before independence. And similarly, other issues like landlessness was a major issue in the country. As you know, land legislation introduced by the British, especially the Wasteland Ordinance, created a lot of problems when it comes to access to land.
Right. Well, let's speak about this in depth as we continue the conversation. Very quickly, let me introduce our panel to you. Nadeem Majid and Shehan Ranatunga are here today. Nadeem, let's start off with you.
Mr. Lassel de Silva, you were talking about corruption and its impact on this situation that we're seeing now. You used to be the secretary of the Presidential Commission into serious acts of fraud, Commission of Inquiry into serious acts of fraud and corruption. We saw also, with regard to these terrorist attacks, that one of the terrorists that was involved in this had in fact been able to procure material for a copper factory that he was running, where they were in fact manufacturing some of the material that was used. And there were allegations that the tender had been rigged in that case as well. So you're seeing a very serious impact of corruption on issues like national security. You spoke also about the culture of impunity. Why is it that this has continued in spite of the impact that it has had on so many different issues over the years? Even through these presidential commissions of inquiry, you see, this hasn't really resulted in accountability. And now the president has appointed another commission, including the former IGP, N.K. Lanka, a former Supreme Court judge. it's difficult to think that there will be, given the history that we've had with presidential commissions of inquiry, it's difficult to think that there will be any kind of accountability at the end of this.
Yeah, in the first place, we have to leave aside these commissions for a little while because it's not, these commissions were brought in for another purpose, basically. Now, let me touch, or let me start by saying, how did they start, getting involved with corruption in the public sector? Because we had rules, regulations, all that, so very rigid, it's not so easy to manipulate all that and all that. Now, like what I said previously, the 1978 Constitution opened floodgates to, should I say it, most unethical, corrupt, say, I don't know, that kind of politicians in the country. Now from 1978, it came on, in 2001, everybody in Parliament agreed that there was so much of politicization in the public sector, and they introduced the 17th Amendment. Actually, that was in order to purify the public sector. Let me say it that way, because to establish those commissions and all that. And it came to a stage, even those commissions, right, I believe to a great extent were manipulated by the so-called corrupt politicos, especially even the presidents. I can name the instances where they did not even appoint, members of the commissions and all that. I'm talking about the independent commissions.
But Mr. De Silva, have these independent commissions been effective? Have they really been independent? Has the Constitutional Council fulfilled its purpose in making these appointments? Another very recent example that you can highlight with regard to this tragedy: soon after the attacks on Sunday morning, a letter started making the rounds on social media and on WhatsApp and on these messaging services. And the initial reaction from the Attorney General was to denounce it as a fake letter from the Attorney General's department. That has since been proved to be false, and that the authenticity of that letter has been confirmed to a degree, let's say. The official who denounced that letter as fake has now been confirmed by the Constitutional Council as the new Chief Justice. So, I mean, what are we even talking about?
I think a very good question. I don't know how I could answer this, because this is the biggest issue, right? Now, let me bring another example, right? Ambedkar had said, you can have the best of constitutions anywhere in the world. If you don't have the best of people to run or at least regulate all that, right, it will become a mess. Now, similarly, there's another example. If you have a herd of lambs being led by a buffalo, or a herd of buffaloes led by a lion, the outcome will be different, right? So naturally, in this country, the biggest problem, in my view, actually, should we say we need virtuous leaders, good leaders, ethical leaders. Now, you asked me one question, right? Say whether the commissions. Now, I must go back to these independent commissions, right? In the 17th Amendment was introduced for a purpose. Actually, there was unanimity, and the 17th agreement, the amendment was passed. It was not implemented to the letter. That's another problem, political, right? So, back again, the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment, I believe, it was so funny, I mean, this is an example where we could think what happens here in this country. If I remember right, it was in 2010, August 30th, it was sent to the cabinet approved and sent to the, say, Chief Justice for an opinion as an urgent bill. And it came to Parliament the day after, within a matter of 10 days, not even 10 days, 8 or 9 days, right? The 18th Amendment was passed. Now, there is provision in the laws where you got to have people, given opportunity, you have to give an opportunity to people to go to courts, or in case if you don't agree, right? So naturally, this is how the laws are being passed in this country. This is an example. Now, you asked me
But
whether...
does the system, what I'm asking is, our system, does it work? I mean, is it just gone beyond dysfunctional? Has this country become almost ungovernable? Because you take, for example, like we all know the importance of there being laws, but I mean, the power of a law rests in its enforcement. You mentioned the independent commissions. The Bribery Commission is one of those independent commissions. During the 52-day constitutional impasse last year, which started off on the 26th of October last year, you spoke about these MPs being bought over for money. Lots of allegations that were going around. There were phone recordings where senior members of parliament were heard offering gratification. There were other phone recordings. I mean, the sums of money that were being spoken about, like 500 million rupees, ₹500 million rupees. All of that evidence, recordings of the phone conversations, all provided to the Bribery Commission. It's about four months now, and more than 4 months now, almost 6 months now, and we're yet to see any action, whereas the law on this is crystal clear. An offer of any kind of monetary or gratification to a member of parliament for them doing or forbearing to do any act in his or her capacity as a member of parliament is a punishable offence under the Bribery Act with 7 years rigorous imprisonment. But even a simple thing like, it's not a simple thing, it's a very serious issue, but even in cases where the law has empowered those commissions to act, there is no action.
You're right.
So who are the people of Sri Lanka to trust? You can't trust the political leadership, you can't trust the bureaucrats, you can't trust the civil service. Who can you trust? Are the people of Sri Lanka wrong then? I mean, you're seeing calls now from many sectors of the public saying maybe what we need is a strong man. Professor Hettige, is what we need a strong man?
Well, I would like to go back to the whole issue of institutions. I think you can't have it both ways. If you say that you are a democracy, if you say that you are let's say, a democratically governed society, based on rule of law, then you have to have institutions that function in keeping with the law of the land. Now, the example that you gave shows very clearly that the institutions do not function as expected in keeping with the law of the land. Now, that is really the most critical issue, because you cannot have a democratic society based on, let's say, popular will and rule of law unless the institutional fabric is already dysfunctional. In other words, really, institutional fabric doesn't really work. Now, I think this is a major issue, and I don't think that we can gloss over this. But I, of course, do not know how we are going to rectify this, because if you are a concerned citizen, and if you are really interested in having a decent government, and if you really interested in having rule of law in the country, then we have no choice. We have to have the institutions that we maintain at public expense. Mind you, you can't maintain these institutions without, spending so much money, because every year our, national budget allocates money to support these institutions. Now, these institutions have everything that they require, because they submit their annual budgets to the treasury, and they are included in the government budget, and the monies are allocated, and the people are there, and and as you
Professor Hettige, like as you're outlining the process that is followed, the money is allocated, it's there in the budget. These institutions exist, and there are laws which these institutions should be enforcing, which clearly are not being enforced. So there is an absence, not just a lack. There appears to be an absence of rule of law, and the institutional framework for a democratic society is missing. That framework is like a house of cards or a matchstick house. So, which means that our democratic society is deeply flawed and very, very weak. So what can we do to, how do we go beyond that? How do we address, do we want to remain as a democratic society? How are we going to fix the institutional framework? Is it just through a virtuous leader or like a strongman leader? Is that the only option that the people have? Sorry, Mr. De Silva?
Can I come in? I think we need a good leader of, the caliber of people like Lee Kuan Yew, Mahathir Mohamad, all that, because we can put this country right. I have read, even in countries like Germany in 1931, they had identical problems like ours now. There was corruption, all that, right? People were very greedy. They were always trying to make a fast buck, say, maybe in the most, say, illegal manner.
This is 1931.
31, right.
And then they picked Hitler.
Yes, right. Now, there was a period they were doing extremely well prior to that. But this period from 1930s, it was a period similar to ours, right? Actually, there are bad patches in the whole world when you look at with regard to other countries too. In our case also, I don't think it is impossible to put this right, because we proved when we were in the commission, right, you need a good leader. And to a great extent, I must just mention a word, initially the present president gave me all the support to push through all that, and we were capable. We were able to send the message across. But how did it fail? Right? It failed. Politicians eventually, now, though it is not relevant, let me say it this way. I just wrote a small note and added it on the Facebook. Think of people like, the police IGP, right? I don't want to paint him white, say whether he's right or wrong. How can an executive president put pressure on a public officer just to say, okay, for the water to flow down from the, lowest place? Independently, people should be given freedom. If in case somebody does not do his job, there's a procedure that needs to be adopted. My way of looking at things here, it is possible to put this whole country right. Actually, the man at the top must take up responsibilities and do his job, say, without any fear or favor.
Thank you, Mr. De Silva. On that note, we go in for a short commercial break. You're watching Face the Nation. We'll be right back.
फिरुनु मेदा बकमहे रबन सुरल हंड अतरे अपे कमे मीर सुया यन्न वरेला यन्न वरेला यन्न वरेला करल बरवीला सतुट उतुराला मे मन रम संतये जीवितयයි समरන්නේ එක මනකකට එකට ඉඳගෙන රටම සමරන වසත් කාලයයි
මේ අපි ජීවිතය සමරන භාග්‍යවන්ත බක්මාසයයි.
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. Professor Siri Hettige, due to the current situation, we see a great deal of fear among communities. International terrorism has become a set of words that we use on a day-to-day basis now, sadly. In this current context, could you take us through the role of multi-religious leaders? We saw a great example in the Cardinal who conducted Mass yesterday, where he spoke of tolerance and love and forgiveness, which was a great example to all of us in the face of the terror that is currently being faced. How must religious leaders of multiple religions come together instead of working in separate silos? How is this important for the multiculturalism and inclusivity that we aspire to have in this country?
Certainly, we are not a secular democracy, and
Sure.
we have really allowed religions to flourish, and we have even a situation where governments have been very supportive of religious institutions, and in fact, I do not know whether there are many countries where you have ministries established to take care of the interest of different denominations. But,
In fact,
you know,
it's also a voter base.
Absolutely.
You have the
But anyway,
Buddhist
now,
vote and the Muslim vote.
One thing we have to remember is that you know, we are not a secular society in the sense that we are a highly religious society, I would say, and you know, and we have been doing surveys among youth, and we have seen how religious even young people are in this country, in the sense that you know, a vast majority of young people in this country are very active in religious kind of activities. So in other words, we are a deeply you know, religious society, in the sense that people are very active in religious affairs. It does not mean that people are always living by what is taught by religious leaders and what is available in the books that they read, and so on and so forth. So there is an incongruence between what I call precept and practice when it comes to religion.
Absolutely.
But nevertheless, we are a deeply divided society on religious terms, and also we are a highly religious society, because you can see even our public domain is very much influenced by religion. I mean, like, we know, I hear people complaining about the noise coming from places of worship early morning and during the night and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, law is very silent, even on noise pollution connected with religious activities and so on and so forth. And also public space is not sacrosanct in this country when it comes to various influences coming from various communities and so on and so forth. So I mean, public space is sacrosanct in many societies. But in Sri Lanka, we don't have the same degree of respect for the public spaces and so on. So what I'm getting at is that that in such a society, religious leaders have a big role to play. And here, I think what is needed is to build consensus. That in spite of all the differences that you have among religions, religious communities, because the people are very much connected to these various denominations, religious leaders certainly can play a major role, provided that they come together and build consensus on the need to maintain, for instance, a public order, to maintain law and order, to maintain, let's say, some degree of peace based on that kind of consensus. So I think there's certainly a role to play. But I think I do not know whether we should also rely on secular institutions to fulfill that particular function as well. It's not only religious institutions and religious leaders. I think also, for instance, law and order institutions have to play even a more important role. So I think it's all together that we probably have to expect, the maintenance of law and public order and peace in the country.
Thank you very much. And also in passing, there's, I believe, Professor, one Supreme Court judgment which deals with noise pollution, I think as far back as 2005. Mr. Lasil De Silva, as a former director of Sri Lanka Parliament, you've spent a couple of decades in the Supreme institution. In terms of the 225 parliamentarians that we, the public, send to make decisions and legislate on our behalf, there's a growing concern and dissatisfaction about their capability and conscionability, as it were. We're looking at a future election within the next few months and next year, the big one. How must the people look at the kind of leaders they want, and do you think it is feasible to actually vote in people that the general public deserves?
It's a very good question, because people sometimes accuse the public, that they elect the wrong type of people to the parliament. Now, my way of looking at it is not, I don't agree that way. Now, all throughout the last few decades, the politicians, the political leadership, they who nominated, and the same nomination list continued for the last couple of decades, because they want them in parliament, and people have no choice. They will have to vote one of them. Actually, without any fear, I'll say most of them are rogues, and they don't respect the rules, regulations, and the laws. What we really need is good people, because a democracy can't be sustained unless you have good leaders, let me also say good institutions. At the same time, maybe good people too in the country, where they honor democratic leadership and democratic institutions. Now, all that had been broken down, not by the people, by our leaders, because we had leaders who selected, say people to give nominations of the type they want. Actually, I would say now the 14th Amendment, right, where they introduced a national list. They were on the pretext that they were going to bring in educated people who had no time to contest elections and all that, amended the law, constitution. Now, this also must be raised, I believe. In 1948, in the Salisbury Constitution, we had only 101 members. Now, when we came to 72, it was raised up to 168, 158 in between, somewhere in 80s or 60s. Then in 1972, it was 168. Then the 78 Constitution, it was raised to 196. Now, 196, actually the 14th Amendment raised it to 225. Now, I think you will remember the 13th Amendment was for the purpose of devolution of power. Now, having devolved power, what did they do? They increased the composition of parliament when in fact they should have reduced the composition of parliament, right? The biggest problem they have in the country is that if they had reduced it to say 120, 125, still, because in other countries also now, India 545, so many, huge population, right?
Mr. De Silva, much like we were talking about this, and Sonali raised this issue as well, people are quite disgusted by Parliament. You hear people on social media using or saying things like they're all the same. And now in light of the current situation, hence we see people saying that there's a need for strong leadership. And Nadeem also mentioned this, people are calling for a strong man. The question I have in this regard is Sri Lanka incapable of an effective democracy? Why must we have to turn to those kind of, severe options? Is society to blame for this situation?
No, actually now look at countries like Singapore, right? It was the leaders who changed it. In China, it was the leaders who changed it. Deng Xiaoping in 1978. When he came, it had come to a certain level, population, so huge, and they needed a change. Now, what did they do? When Deng Xiaoping came in, the youth thought that he was not going to deliver results, right? True, as you said, you need a good leader, strong leader, firm leader. But I would say a firm leader who is committed to uplift the masses, uplift the country, economically, in all that sense. Unfortunate situation here in this country, in my view, we did not have a good administrator at the top. Our CEO all throughout had been always a miserable failure. We expected Jayajawardena, with all the experience he had, everything he had, you name it, he was named as a very